It's the 2022 World Cup. It's the squad update for Netherlands. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin and today we'll be looking at Netherlands squad for the 2022 World Cup. We've done a podcast on the groups which took a close look at the Netherlands team, as well as a player media cast which went through each of the candidates who had a chance of making it to the final squad. And that ended with a prediction of the starters. This media cast is an addendum to that. In other words, we won't be repeating all of that information, but we will simply be adding on to it. Okay, well, we'll be summarizing it a bit and adding on to it. So it's not necessary to listen to that version, but the conclusions that we draw here are both based on that information and explained in more detail there. So we recommend the full player podcast, but if we have time, we're hoping to release a player version focused solely on the players in the final squad, so giving the bios of just those 26 players. Okay, well, the final squad has been released, and for most teams, a preliminary squad too. Today, we can find out how accurate we were in our predictions in the full podcast or full media cast. And we're going to list the names of the candidates we considered definite, likely, and possible, and then announce who made the preliminary and then the final squad. As we guessed, most squads had a few surprises. Players who didn't make it and new or unexpected players who did. And we'll go over those players and summarize them again at the end. We'll also discuss whether the selections and the games played since June 2022 have changed our thoughts or our predictions on the starters and on the team's progress. Have changed our thoughts on our predicted starters and the team's progress. So here we go. I'm wearing orange, Netherlands orange, not a soccer shirt, but at least a color match. So here we go. We'll talk about their formations. So in the main podcast for players, we went through their formations since, in the Euro Cup and since. Actually, after the Euro Cup, they underwent a manager change. And it's actually pretty easy to summarize for Netherlands. In the Euro Cup under Frank de Boer, it was a 3-4-1-2, and in World Cup qualifying all the way through, it was a 4-3-3, and then they started to vary it in Nations League play, actually going with a three-man back line in those June games. Various formations, a 3-5-2, a 3-4-2-1, and a 3-4-1-2. But for the last three games, and that includes the 2 September games, it was a 3-4-1-2. So kind of going back to the formation that they went through the Euro Cup with. Those 2 September games were an away game in Poland, which was a 2-0 win, and the last game was at home to Belgium, which was a 1-0 win, and they came first in their Nations League group. So just a comment on those games. Both of the games featured potential starting players. So even though they were trying out a lot of players in the June games of Nations League, not so much in the September games. In fact, the defense and the wingers were the same, while the central midfielders and 2 of the 3 forward positions did have changes in the second game, but they were kind of likely candidates. So not trying out new candidates so much there. Okay, let's move on now to talk about the squad. And so we will kind of introduce the players by name and then delete the ones who actually didn't make the preliminary squad and point out which ones passed the preliminary squad and were selected for the final squad. So we'll begin with the manager. Frank de Boer, as we mentioned, was the manager that took them through the Euro Cup, and he is out, and Louis van Gaal replaced him as their manager. So Van Gaal was actually quite steady in the squad choice and formation through the World Cup qualifying games, but suddenly turned experimentative for the Nations League games in June. And that actually seemed a bit odd because the formula had seemed to work well during qualification. They earned qualification in first place. However, even with all the changes in June, they did win their Nations League group. And in the two September games, the squad seemed a lot more settled. However, there were some decisions for the final squad which were baffling, as we will see pretty quickly, because the biggest decision that was baffling was for goalkeepers. So Louis van Gaal leading them through the World Cup. Okay, for goalkeepers, we had no definite candidates there, but we have three likely candidates in Jasper Cillessen, Tim Krul, and Mark Flecken. We also had three possible candidates in Justin Bilo and Joel Drommel and Kjell Scherpen. So we will go through those players to see how they did. But we also had Marco Bizzo, who seemed to be off the squad anyway. And we had Martin Stecklenburg retiring from the squad. So we're deleting them from the list right now and focusing our attention on these six players. Well, Jasper Cillessen. Okay, well, I'll start with Tim Krul because he was a surprise non-selection. We had considered him likely, but he was not selected for the final squad. And among the likely candidates, Joel Drommel, Joel Drommel was not selected, and nor was Kjell Scherpen. But for Kjell Scherpen, it might have been related to injury. He was out with a knee injury from late October. And that's right around the time the team was selected. So we're not sure if that was the primary reason for this decision. For us, though, he was just a possible candidate. So it might have been just that he wasn't selected for the squad. So that leaves us with Jasper Cillessen and Mark Flecken and Justin Bilo. Jasper Cillessen and Mark Flecken made the preliminary squad, so it looked like they were heading towards the final squad. However, they were not selected for the final squad, neither of them. Justin Bilo was, and then two new goalkeepers were brought in that I will introduce here, new candidates. And so because we didn't talk about them in the previous podcast, we'll introduce them here. And the first one is Remco Pasveer, and the second is Andre Noppert. So, wow, that's a big surprise. Let's introduce them. And Remco Pasveer had been new to the squad, so he came in September. He actually started both of the September games. Sorry, I have a bit of a tickle in my throat here. So that gives him 2 caps since 2022. He's not a youngster. He's actually 39 years old. So just lots of surprising information here. So he is with Ajax in Netherlands since 2021 and has played his whole career for various clubs in the Netherlands. He was with Vitesse before that and PSV Eindhoven from 2014 to 2017, and with fairly small clubs, Heracles and Go Ahead Eagles, he was loaned to. He was with 20 actually, which is a bit of a bigger club, from 2003 to 2006, kind of showcasing how long he has been around, but new to the national team here. Also, we have Andries Noppert. So he also new to the squad, appearing on the bench in the last games there in September. Didn't see any field time there, so he has no caps. He is 28 years old and plays for Heerenveen in the Netherlands since 2022, and he was with the Go Ahead Eagles before that from 2021 to 22. So a real surprise there. So let's finish this section by kind of summarizing the situation with goalkeepers. So back in the Euro Cup, Martin Stecklenburg was the keeper in the cup, but he retired after that. It was actually Justin Billow who took over after that for all of the World Cup qualification games, except for the last one. He was out injured after that and never returned, even though he did recover from injury. Flecken and Sillessen shared duties after that. That would be for the last World Cup qualifying game. And I think there were a couple of friendlies in there, but mainly for the June Nations League games. However, the new keeper, Pasveer, who had not even been on the bench to that point, started the 2 September Nations League games. So really a stunning decision here. These 3 goalkeepers, so Billow, Pasveer and Noppert, have a total of 8 caps among themselves. And that compares to Jasper Sillessen's 63 caps. So Netherlands not bringing a lot of international experience to the Cup through their goalkeepers. All right, let's move on to the defenders, central defense. So we have definite candidates Stefan de Vrij and Virgil van Dijk. And we have likely candidates Matthijs de Ligt and Nathan Ake. And possible candidates Jurien Timber, Jordan Teze, and Bruno Martins Indi. So let's see which of those who made it. So no surprise, Stefan de Vrij and Virgil van Dijk were selected for the final squad. Also, the likely candidates Matthijs de Ligt and Nathan Ake made it to the squad. And among the possible candidates, only Jurien Timber made it. So we'll say goodbye to Jordan Teze and Bruno Martins Indi, but I do have a comment on Bruno Martins Indi. He was out with a groin injury in mid-September, and he recovered long enough to play just a half of a game with his club before being out with a different problem, a thigh problem, from early October. And he was not listed as injured for the September games there. So I think that was between the 2 injuries, but not selected for this squad either. So we only had him as a possible candidate, so we can speculate as to whether or how much the injury played a role in his non-selection. Anyway, let's go back and look at how things have gone for the central defenders. So it was De Vrij and Van Dijk. They seem to be the central pairing, with De Ligt coming in when it's a 3-man backline, or else De Ligt coming in as a backup. However, and that was pretty much the situation all through World Cup qualification, but it got blown up in the June's Nations League games with 4 new players coming into the position, including Ake and Timber. In the September games, it was actually Ake and Timber flanking Van Dijk. And that's where things stand right now. So a little bit hard. We'll come back to this when we try to predict the starters. But Stefan de Vrij seemed a fixture there, but the September games put that in a little bit of doubt. All right, let's move on to the left back position, and we have a definite candidate in Daley Blind and a likely candidate in Tyrell Malacia. We had possible but unlikely Owen Windall. He didn't make it. Actually, he was injured for the June games, but he did recover, so that injury wasn't the reason that he was left off the squad. We also had Patrick Van Onholt, who even when we did the full podcast seemed to be off the squad, so we will erase that name because he wasn't selected. And let's go back to Daley Blind. He was selected for the final squad, as was Tyrell Malacia, or Malakia. So just those 2 left backs being brought to the Cup. And this position is actually often a left winger position, given the 3-man back line. So if you think of the 3-man central defense, the players who are right back and left back push up to the winger position. And it's almost exclusively been Daley Blind since the 2021 Euro Cup. But Malacia did rotate in for the June Nations League games. So right at the end started rotating in. So we were anxious to see what happened in September to see if this is becoming a shared position. But it doesn't seem that way, as Daley Blind started both of the September Nations League games. All right, let's move on to the right backs, and we start with definite candidate Denzel Dumfries and possible candidate Hans Hateboer. So we don't have a likely, just a possible there. And we have two possible but unlikely candidates, Jeremy Frimpong and Devin Wrench. And finally, we have a player who seems to be off the squad, Joel Veltman. And Joel Veltman didn't make the squad, so we'll erase him. And same with, no, Devin Wrench actually did make the preliminary squad, but didn't make the final cut. And Denzel Dumfries did make the squad. However, the possible candidate, Hans Hateboer, did not make the squad, so we will erase him from here. However, the possible but unlikely Jeremy Frimpong did make the squad. So that leaves us with the two right backs, Denzel Dumfries and Jeremy Frimpong, kind of getting ahead, it seems, of Hans Hateboer in the pecking order to make the squad here. We had Jeremy Frimpong as an unlikely candidate because he hadn't, when we did the first podcast, hadn't earned his first cap for the national team. I'm not sure how his name came up, actually, but he does have good club affiliations. He's with Bayer Leverkusen in Germany and was with Celtic in Scotland before that, and was part of Manchester City's youth club. So a player for the future, but on the squad this time, the 22-year-old, I'm not sure he'll see that much action. But there we have it. So Devin Wrench, who made the preliminary squad, we're going to remove him from the list also. Okay, let's move on to the midfield, and we'll start with defensive midfields. The defensive midfielders, and we have Teun Koopmeiners as a definite candidate here, and Jordi Schuiten as a possible candidate. So, sorry, Teun Koopmeiners is not definite. He's a likely candidate. Jordi Schuiten, a possible candidate. Those are the only two we have as defensive midfielders. And we might as well dispense with that now, that Teun Koopmeiners did make the final squad, while Jordi Schuiten did not even make the preliminary squad there. We're going to introduce central midfielders before we kind of summarize the position. So for central midfielders, we have Frankie de Jong as a definite candidate. And we have Martin de Roon as possible, and Ryan Gravenberch as a possible player. We don't have any possible but unlikely. We do have a player who seemed to be off the squad, Donny van der Beek, who we talked about in the previous podcast, but we won't talk about here. And we also have the injured candidate, Jorginho Wijnaldum, who we will talk about a bit later when it comes to the injuries. Okay, Frankie de Jong then did make the final squad. No surprise there, as he was a definite candidate. Martin de Roon also made the final squad. However, he was out for a couple of games in late October and mid-November, so that's very recent, with muscle problems. However, that didn't seem to hamper his selection, but I wonder if it will be an issue for him in the Cup. Meanwhile, Ryan Gravenberch made the preliminary squad, but did not make the final squad, so I'll talk a little bit about him. Ryan Gravenberch had been out with injury for June games, for the Nations League games in June. But that's not the reason the well-affiliated player was not selected, because he was fit by August and playing as a substitute for Bayern Munich. And in fact, he was also used as a substitute in the last friendly game in September, though he was only on the field for 1 minute. So didn't make the squad this time, not selected. Seems to be a candidate for the future, especially because, his club affiliations, Bayern Munich in Germany, and he is also with Ajax in the Netherlands. So, and also was part of the Euro 2020 squad too. Anyway, we are going to erase Ryan Gravenberch from the list here. And hope that he comes back in the future. And one last thing, we have a new candidate in this position, and that is Kenneth Taylor. A new candidate, Kenneth Taylor. And I'll tell you a bit about him because we didn't introduce him in the previous podcast, and that was because he's new to the squad. He subbed into both of the September games there, and those were his first 2 caps, even his first appearance on the bench or first appearance for the team. So he's just 20 years old and has those 2 caps since 2022, and he plays for Ajax in the Netherlands, having come through their youth system. So Kenneth Taylor selected above players like Ryan Gravenberch. So that is the central midfielder. So now we will talk about the defensive and central midfielders together. So Frankie de Jong played alone in World Cup qualification and had been paired with De Roon in the 2020 in the 2021 Euro Cup formation, and we have defensive midfielder Koop Meiners making inroads in the June Nations League games. So actually it was Frankie de Jong and Koopmeiners starting the first of the September Nations League games, and a totally different pairing in the second game. It was De Roon partnered with the right midfielder Berghuis in the second game. So a little uncertain there, but we'll come back to it in picking the predicted starters. We move on to left midfielders, and there we actually have moved the attacking midfielder Davy Klaassen to this position, and that's because he primarily played as a left midfielder during this period. He sometimes did play as an attacking midfielder, I think 2 or 3 games as an attacking midfielder, but tended to play on the right side, or on the left side of central midfield. So Davy Klaassen, and we had considered him we had considered him a likely candidate, and indeed he was chosen for the final squad. So Davy Klaassen going to the World Cup. Let's actually talk about the position before we move on to the right side. So if you think about the 4-3-3 formation in the 2021 Euro Cup and the 5-man midfield in some of the June Nations League games, we see that actually the position of left midfielder, or more of a left central midfielder, not as far as a winger, was used quite a bit. And when it was used, it was Davy Klaassen. So again, the position was rarely used after that, though. It was rarely used in the June and September Nations League games. So I think that's when Davy Klaassen went back to being an attacking midfielder. Okay, let's take a look at the right midfielder role. And actually, this is where Georginio Wijnaldum was playing for part of the time. He's coded as a central midfielder, but we moved him to right midfielder because that's where he played during this period. And I should stress that it was just during this period after the Euro Cup, because in the Euro Cup he had been an attacking midfielder, and actually in qualifying for the Euro Cup had scored quite a few goals as an attacking midfielder. However, bad news came quite a while ago, actually, that he had a fractured tibia, and I don't know if we knew by the time we did the main podcast for players, but he is out until January 2023, so no chance of of him recovering in time for the cup. So that's too bad. He was their captain. Now Virgil van Dijk is going to be the captain. So Giorgio Wijnaldum, a big loss. Also, a player we've put on as a right midfielder here is right winger Steven Berghuis. Again, we're moving him because he played in this position more. And Steven Berghuis is a definite candidate. So I'm just going to move him up here. Actually, he played as a right winger as well, so perhaps I shouldn't move him, but for some reason he's on my list here, so might as well deal with him now. He is a definite candidate, and he did make the squad, and that's all we'll say about that. I'll just note that Wijnaldum is injured here on the graphic. For the YouTube people. Okay, injured Giorgio Wijnaldum, definite candidate Steven Berghuis making the squad. So I'll summarize the right midfielder. It's pretty much the same story as the left. So the 4-3-3 in the 2021 Euro Cup and the 5-man midfield. In June, Nations League qualifications saw the position used quite a bit, and it was Giorgio Wijnaldum all the way through World Cup qualifications. So coming back from an attacking midfielder role under Frank de Boer into a central midfield role, right central midfield role under the new manager. And also Berghuis, who had been an attacking midfielder and even a right forward, moved back into this position after Wijnaldum's injury. So kind of like Wijnaldum was playing an attacking role, but came back to cover Wijnaldum's position. So again, the position was used rarely in the June and September Nations League games, in which case Berghuis did go forward a couple of times. Okay, let's look at the left wingers. And here we have likely candidate Steven Bergwijn, and also Noah Lang, and also Cody Gakpo. All three of them likely candidates. And we also had Ryan Babel, but he seemed to be off the squad and was not selected, so we delete him from the list here. And let's look and see which of these three likely candidates made it. Well, in fact, all of them did. So Steven Bergwijn selected, Noah Lang and Cody Gakpo all selected for the final squad, and we'll take a look at the position. In fact, for Netherlands, the position is more often a left forward, but we'll cover it here since these players, all coded as left wingers, were playing in that left forward position for the most part. And in fact, not only were they playing as left forwards, but these are the players who also covered the central attacking midfield role and the right forward role for the large part. So in that sense, it's a bit of a rotation of these players up front, because they switch over from right to left to center. So a lot of times we'll see two of them. And I should point out that Noah Lang was out with an ankle injury for the September games, but he did recover and he was playing for his club by early October. So his injury not a concern there. Finally, we'll the third kind of section, we'll move on to forwards. And in forwards, we cover attacking midfielders. And well, the first attacking midfielder there is the definite candidate Davy Klaassen, but we covered him as a left midfielder there because he played there more. We also have a possible candidate in Guus Til, and we have a Mohamed Ihataren. Mohamed Ihataren, but he seemed to be off the squad and indeed wasn't chosen, so we'll delete him from the list. However, we do have a new candidate here, and that is Xavi Simons. Xavi Simons was selected for the squad, And so I have to introduce him because we didn't cover him in the previous podcast. He's new to the squad, never appearing for the national team before being named to the preliminary squad. So not even involved in those September games. He has no caps for the Netherlands then, and is 19 years old, so very young, and plays for PSV Eindhoven in the Netherlands since 2022, and was with Paris Saint-Germain before that, and actually came up through Paris Saint-Germain's youth club. And he is actually with Barcelona's youth club for a long time before that, from 2010 to 2019. So very good club affiliation there. Maybe this cup comes a little bit too soon for him, but we may see him down the road, or we may see him getting onto the field during this cup. Meanwhile, I didn't cover Goose Till. Goose Till did not make the final squad. He made the preliminary squad, but didn't make the final cut there. And so ultimately he gets removed from the list here. Okay, moving on to forwards. We have Memphis Depay as a definite candidate. And we have two likely candidates, Donyell Malen and Wout Weghorst. And then two possible candidates in Arnaud Danjuma and Vincent Janssen. And in fact, we have a possible but unlikely candidate in Luc de Jong, but we keep him on the list because he was selected not only for the preliminary squad, but for the final squad. So I'll come back to that shortly. Quincy Promes seems to be off the squad, and indeed was not selected for the squad. So let's go over those players. Memphis Depay was selected for the final squad. However, big news, he played the first September friendly, but he was out of the second with a thigh problem. And he's been off the team since then, so the end of September, until now, with an unknown return date. So a big worry for Netherlands as to whether he'll be fit enough to make the squad. But they have named him to the squad, of course, in hopes of his recovery. So they will definitely be hoping for that. Donyell Malen made the preliminary squad, but did not make the final squad. He really hadn't been playing in the Nations League games. I think he played I think he played one game in World Cup qualifying and none in the Nations League games. So off the squad ultimately here. Wout Weghorst, though, did make the final squad. The possible candidate Arnaud Danjuma made the preliminary squad, but not the final squad. And Vincent Janssen, who had kind of come back after a 6.5-year absence, right at the end there in June 2022, did make the final squad. So interesting developments there. But we have to say goodbye here to Donyell Malen, because he didn't make the final cut from the preliminary squad, and same with Arnaud Danjuma. But with Arnaud Danjuma, I should say that he had been injured for the June games all the way up to mid-September with muscular problems. He did recover from that, but he was not called up for the September games and ultimately not selected. So perhaps his muscle injury is kind of getting in the way of his selection there. But a big surprise here in Luc de Jong being selected for the squad. We had him as possible but unlikely, and the reason was he had played none of their 13 games since the 2021 Euro Cup, and he was only on the bench for 2 games, but not selected for 11 others. So that made us consider him possible but unlikely. And lo and behold, here he is on the squad. Okay, so that gives us our 26 players for the squad, and we're going to look at a few statistics for these 26 players. And the average age is 26.3 years old. So Again, we've always been saying 25 to 27 is kind of in range, but we are finding it a little bit older for these World Cup squads. So I would say that maybe puts Netherlands slightly on the younger side among all the players here. They only have one player who's 33 years or older. One player who's 33 years or older, and that is the surprising selection of goalkeeper Remco Pasveer. He's 39 years old, so 7 years older than the next oldest player on the squad. That's Daley Blind and Luke de Jong, both 32 years old. They do have a number of players who are in their 30s. That would be eight players in all, but I would say 33 is starting to get old as a soccer player. Goalkeepers having a bit longer shelf life there. Anyway, so yes, reasonably young. And keeping the squad young is the fact that they have 5 players who are 22 years old or younger. So bringing some youth to the squad. Jurien Timber, Jeremy Frimpong, both 21 years old. Davy Klaassen, who's actually a starter. And Kenneth Taylor, both 20 years old. And Xavi Simons, 19 years old there. The average number of caps among these players, interestingly, is exactly the same as their average age, which was quite amazing there. Just a little off-topic statistic for you here, which is kind of interesting. The total number of years in the squad. Sorry, I've kind of lost my place here. The total number of years among the squad members is 683. So the total of their ages adds up to 683, and the total number of caps adds up to exactly the same thing, 683. What a coincidence. So the average number of caps. So actually that's a bit kind of below average compared to most of the other teams. The average that I have is 30.2, so a below average number of caps for Netherlands. Okay, the total number of goals they have amongst these 26 players is 105, and total goals for caps is 15.4%. So let me put that in a bit of context for you. Actually, the total number looks a little bit low, but because they don't have a large number of caps among the players, it works out to 15.4%. So that is actually quite high in terms of scoring, because the average is 13.1%. So they score quite a bit more than most teams. And let's take a look at that scoring. Actually, to a large degree, it comes down to Memphis Depay, who has 42 goals in 81 games, putting him above 50%. So that's a goal every second game, a very high average for a forward. And in fact, Vincent Janssen is the next highest. He has 7 goals in his 20 games. Steven Bergwijn not far behind at 29%, and Davy Klaassen at 25%. So those aren't huge numbers, but they're very respectable scoring ratios. Some of the others are around 20%, but they don't really have enough games to make it a valid statistic. So perhaps I'll leave it at that. But the only other comment I'll make is that they do get goals from defenders and from all over the field. So especially the Denzel Dumfries, Virgil van Dijk, and even Nathan Ake kind of score some of their goals. Okay, we end the podcast with some summaries here. So first of all, we'll talk about the notable non-selections in review. So I'll add the outgoing manager, Frank de Boer, or actually went after the Euro 2021 Cup there. Frank de Boer no longer with the Netherlands here. Jasper Cillessen, the goalkeeper, a very notable non-selection. He was the most experienced goalkeeper they had. Tim Krul also not making the squad. nor Mark Flacken. That's a bit less of a surprise than the other two, but the fact that all three of them being likely goalkeepers and none of them being selected is really a surprise. Ryan Gravenberch, well, we did have him as a possible candidate, and there was some injury involved with him. I only mentioned him because he's got good club affiliations with Bayern Munich and actually on the field for Bayern Munich, so not chosen for the squad. I think we will see him further down the road. And forwards, Daniel Malen, not selected. We considered him a likely candidate, and a bit less of a surprise, Arno Danjuma. We considered him a possible candidate. Okay, surprise inclusions is next. So we have Justin Billow. I guess that's a bit of a surprise given that the three likely goalkeepers were not selected. He was just a possible for us. But he has been included in the squad, so managed to get ahead of the competition there. But even more so, Remco Pasveer coming in from out of nowhere, it seems, to make the squad. People who follow club soccer in the Netherlands won't consider it out of nowhere, but from an outsider point of view, it really comes as a surprise. And Andries Noppert, also the goalkeeper, coming in suddenly at the end here. Jeremy Frimpong, the right defender, we had him as a possible but unlikely candidate, but he did make the squad. And Luc de Jong, the forward, also making the squad. We also had him as possible but unlikely. So a few surprises there. By the manager Louis van Gaal, who we'll consider a kind of a new manager. In truth, he's nothing but new. This is his third stint with the Netherlands, and he's a pretty familiar figure. But he is the new manager since the after the last Euro Cup, so we'll put him on the list. And then we have Kenneth Taylor. I mean, in addition to the surprise candidates, the goalkeepers, Pasveer and Noppert, they'd also be in this new category. Kenneth Taylor, the central midfielder, a new candidate, just coming in September. And Xavi Simons, same story, just getting his first appearance on the team in November or in those September friendlies. And we have updates on injuries, and actually that's quite a few names for Netherlands, so I'll go quite fast here. We have a couple of players who are recovered from injury, so we did talk about that above. We won't repeat it here, we'll just give their names. Noah Lang was injured, but it looks like it's not going to be a problem. And Arno Danjuma didn't make the squad actually, but his injury was not the reason. He was recovered in time for the selection, but just wasn't selected. Next, we have people who are injury doubts. These ones I will give a couple of details on. We do have Martin de Roon. So he was out for a couple of games in late October and mid-November. Mid-November is now. He's on the injury list right now with muscle problems. It didn't prevent him from being selected, but it might be an issue going into the Cup. And then a much bigger worry, Memphis Depay, playing the first September friendly, but out injured with a thigh problem for the second one. And he's been out all the way since late November until now with an unknown return date. Well, no surprise to me that they would still name him to the squad, even if he was injured, but we'll have to keep our eye on that as it comes up to the Cup. Obviously, they're hoping he'll recover. Players who were dropped due to injury, also a big loss for them in Jorginho Wijnaldum. So we won't repeat the whole story there, but a fractured tibia, so not expected to recover until January 2023. So that's two big names on the injury. And then we have a few players who were injured, but were not strong candidates to begin with. So we'll just give the names and the likelihood they were at of making the squad. So goalkeeper Kjell Scherpen, we had him as a possible candidate, but out injured. Owen Windahl. He actually did recover from his injury, so it wasn't the reason he was left off. But anyway, he was just a possible but unlikely candidate. And Bruno Martins Indy, his injury might have played a role in his non-selection, but he was only a possible candidate. So we're not sure whether he was just not selected or whether the injury played a role. Okay, well, we're going to talk about predicted starters, but I have to populate the thing. So I will, this is the magic section of the podcast. I will populate it right now. It is done. Okay, predicted starters. Well, Louis van Gaal, we'll call him a starter, the starting manager. And we're sure he won't be dismissed before the tournament starts. In terms of goalkeepers, well, with all the new goalkeepers coming in, even at the end of the main podcast on players, we had no idea, and we didn't feel confident enough to nominate a starter. It turns out we were kind of right, because had we nominated any, we would have nominated the likely candidates, and none of them were chosen. We actually thought that Billo might return from injury. He was the goalkeeper that kind of replaced Stecklenburg after the Euro 2020. So we thought there was a chance of him returning from his injury to resume the starting position that he gained after the Euro Cup, but we certainly didn't expect a keeper outside of these candidates to come in and snatch the spot. But that's what seems to have happened, because even though Billo was recovered by the September friendlies, it was Pasveer who played both of them. So we're really not sure which of those it'll be. I think we kind of have to give the nod to Pasveer, but we're going to be a bit conservative here and say that it might be Justin Billo kind of returning to the starting spot, or Pasveer coming in, not dead sure, but maybe 52% Pasveer and 48% Billo. Okay, the other goalkeeper is Andries Noppert, so I'll try to name the players here. Okay, in central defense we have Stefan de Vrij, Virgil van Dijk, Matthias de Ligt, Nathan Ake, and Jurrien Timber all making the squad. And we had nominated De Vrij and Van Dijk as starters, but now we can only be sure about Van Dijk as a starter, given that Ake and Timber flanked him in both of the September games. We have to consider them on a par with De Vrij, or perhaps even ahead of them. So we're gonna and it's not that we're so hesitant, it's just the evidence the manager is giving us to go on. We consider Van Dijk a starter, but we can only posit that it'll be two of these three players, De Vrij, De Ligt, and Ake. Sorry, not De Ligt, but Timber. De Ligt we consider a kind of a half a step behind the other ones in terms of his chances of being a starter. Okay, well, it gets a bit easier as we move on to the left back position. So we have Daley Blind and Tyrell Malacia, or Malacia, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. We had nominated Daley Blind as the starter. However, in the June games, they were rotating. Malacia and Blind were rotating the position, each playing two of the games, and that gave us some pause. But Blind starting both of the September Nations League games reestablishes our confidence in him as the starter. So he'll get the starter, and we think Malacia will be his backup. In the right back position, we had nominated Dumfries as the starter, and I swear to God, I will swallow my computer mouse without chewing if that is not the way it turns out. So we're confident enough to be swallowing computer mouse about this. Okay, defensive and central midfielders. We had nominated Frankie de Jong as the starter. Koopmeiners increasingly became the partner when it was two players in the central midfield. But Koopmeiners has not done enough to make us think he's a starter. So we put Frankie de Jong as a starter and Koopmeiners as a sometimes starter or a maybe starter in this case. Martin de Roon seems to have kind of dropped out. Behind Koopmeiners there in our estimation. Okay, left midfielders, we have I didn't mention all the names of the central midfielders. Martin de Roon, Kenneth Taylor is the new candidate there, but he'll almost certainly be on the bench. Left midfielders, we have Davy Klaassen as the only candidate, and he sometimes plays as an attacking midfielder. We actually moved him from there to left midfielder. Regardless, wherever he plays, we do think he's going to be a starter. Hang on, I have a note to myself here that we're downgrading him to a sometime starter. Let me see what I was thinking. He was in the first podcast, we had left him as an attacking midfielder where he does sometimes play. He was primarily left midfield, although he saw fewer starts during the Nations League games. That's why we downgraded him to kind of a yellow, a sometimes starter, because recently he was starting a bit less. Okay, sorry about the confusion there. Right midfielders, we had nominated Berghuis as a starter, and he's the only candidate in this position, Steven Berghuis. And as we said, he has been playing as a right midfielder, or really more like a right central midfielder, since Wijnaldum's injury. He came back, just like Wijnaldum had, from playing an attacking role to that right central midfield role. And when Wijnaldum got injured, Berghuis took it up there. So we think he's a definite candidate, but it is possible he will show up elsewhere on the field. So not necessarily the starting right midfielder, but a starting player nonetheless. Okay, left wingers, we have Steven Bergwijn, Noah Lang, and Cody Gakpo as the candidates. And Bergwijn gets the most starts, and he started both September Nations League games, so that bumps him up to a definite, in our opinion. Gakpo is getting more starts as time goes. He played as a central attacking midfielder in 2 of the last 3 Nations League games, so we're going to move him up to a sometimes starter. And Lang does get some starts, but we don't think he gets enough starts to view him as a starter. So we consider him more of a substitute. Wouldn't be shocked to see him start a game, though. Right wingers, we don't actually have any candidates here in the right wing. Berghuis held the position in World Cup qualifying, but as we said, moved back to right midfielder to replace Wijnaldum. So we covered him there. The left winger, Bergwijn, has often actually moved over to play right winger since Berghuis moved back, but we've covered Bergwijn. And forward Janssen moved into the position in the last few games, so we'll cover him when we get to forwards right away here. So and actually, it was Janssen and Bergwijn in the last 2 games in September. They're playing in this position. So we dealt with Bergwijn as a left winger, and we'll talk about Janssen as a forward here. Okay, among the attacking midfielders, Wijnaldum and Klaassen and Gakpo are the main players here. But we've considered each of these players elsewhere, so no starters to be named here. Now let's look at the forwards. So for the forwards, we had nominated Memphis Depay as the starter, and we're sticking with that, although he only started half the Nations League games in June and September, so not getting as many regular starts as he used to. And Vincent Janssen is making inroads and may get a start, but he hasn't done enough. He hadn't done so enough for us to consider him a starter. So we're still considering Memphis Depay a starter, even though he is not starting every game recently. And I think we're going to mark Vincent Janssen in yellow because he looks like he might be taking that right forward position over. Okay, and then Wout Weghorst and Luc de Jong seem to be substitutes for us. All right, let's finish with closing thoughts. So rather than reassessing their prospects and repeating everything we said in the Player podcast, we're going to ask a simple question here. Does the selection change our opinion about their chances? So I'm going to say yes to this. Netherlands seemed such a stable squad in World Cup qualifying, and for that reason, I was baffled that they were making so many changes in the Nations League games in June, especially. Nevertheless, they did well in the Nations League and finished first in their group, so we can't be too critical about that. But some of the decisions in the squad selection, especially among goalkeepers, do give reason to worry. I'm a bit worried that 8 international caps among the three of them really is a dangerous lack of international experience. Furthermore, the high number of injuries is a concern. We saw the injury to Wijnaldum, and now Depay is under a little bit of is under threat of not being able to play in the tournament. Netherlands do have the depth to cover that. But at what point does it start to catch up with them if they're losing kind of key players? I mean, we can hardly consider Vincent Janssen the equal of Memphis Depay as a replacement. So my thinking is Netherlands may be strong enough to get through the group stage. But I think these injuries may catch up with them in the latter stages, or we might even see their effect showing in the group stage with, say, a tie against Senegal, Ecuador or Japan, or even a tougher than expected game against these teams. And that's really to say nothing of the psychological elements at play for Netherlands. On the one hand, they may have the usual overconfidence that European teams are prone to, playing teams from outside of Europe, or they may have a lack of confidence having missed 2 major tournaments in recent times, as well as a relatively quick exit from the group stage of Euro 2020 after a strong group stage. That happened in 2008 too. There's also the always looming threat of discord among the players of Netherlands that they're famous for, and I don't really see Van Gaal as the kind of manager to bring great unity to a team that's fighting amongst themselves. Having said all that, I don't mean to be negative, and Netherlands often do fly through the group stage, and they may well do that here. And of course, that would help their psychology. The other thing is that my speculation on the psychology may be dead wrong, and that they do have the psychology and the talent to overcome these problems. But honestly, my belief is that they haven't really shown enough evidence since 2014 that they have the ability to do well in tournaments. So I would need more evidence to think that I'm dead wrong here. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the podcast. And keep in mind, we may be editing together a list of the bios of the 26 final candidates. And that would mostly be outtakes from the Main Player podcast or the Main Player mediacast that we did. In other words, I'll be splicing together the players from the Main Media podcast rather than recording a new one. And if we do that, that'll come out in the first few days of the Cup. It depends on whether we have time to do it. I personally would like to have that as I drive to my brother's to watch a game. It would be good to kind of go over the list of players. Okay, meanwhile, keep an eye on us at Soccerphiles Canada. I keep forgetting to show the closing graphic here to our YouTube watchers. Keep an eye on us at Soccerphiles Canada. That's Soccerphiles with a PH in the middle and an S at the end. And our website at soccerphiles.captivate.fm. And check the show notes for links to our website and previous podcast series. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you back for the next team. Bye-bye.